Miller Center of the University of Virginia, a conversation on politics, policy, and the presidency. For the Record with Charley McDowell.
Our guest today is civil rights activist, author, professor, and recently elected chair of the NAACP, Julian Bond. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I want to take you back through your life fairly fast. Your father, Horace Mann Bond, was president of a college in Georgia. Then he was president of the country's oldest black private college, Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. Dean of the School of Education in Atlanta, and so forth and so forth. You've mentioned it, but I am still stuck with it. What an interesting life. The house guests you've known, W.E.B. Du Bois, you talk about like he was down the street. This was a remarkable boyhood, wasn't it?
The biggest influences on me are my own parents and the circumstances they provided for me. My father was an educator, later college president and dean. That meant I grew up on black college campuses, and these places were, and I guess many of them still are, sort of oases in the middle of whatever. And they provided a protective environment, as any college campus does. Think if you grew up on the campus of the University of Virginia, how pleasant that would be. Surrounded by older people who know you're the president's son and therefore treat you a little better than they might ordinarily, and living in just this stimulating, intellectually stimulating environment. It also means that to your home come the bright lights of the day. One of my proudest possessions is a photograph of W.E.B. Du Bois, my father, the great sociologist C. Franklin Frazier. These three men are dressed in academic regalia, and my sister and I, I'm 2.5 and she's 4, are being dedicated to a lifetime of scholarship. Now, of course, I had no idea that I would end up being a teacher, but I mean, Du Bois is there. I have a picture of myself sitting on Paul Robeson's knee while he sings to me the 4 insurgent generals. And of course, I had no idea at the time who Paul Robeson was or what he meant, but it was because I lived on these campuses that these figures came into my presence. So I had held up before me these models of what I could be, what I might be, very differently, I think, than the lives of most people, black or white. So I was lucky as I could be.
And then you went off to Morehouse College, which I gather was a quality operation.
It was and is. Was and is. You know, they teach us when we come in that it was and is.
It was and is.
Yes.
All right, you know. And there, it seems like this lucky and so forth life continued. You
well,
must have
I don't
loved
know
it.
if it's luck or chance. I was sitting in a cafe one day, about February 2nd or 3rd, 1960, and this guy comes up to me, a student. He holds up this paper. The paper says, "Greensboro students sit in for third day." He said, "Had you seen that?" And I said, "Sure, I've seen that." He said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "It's great, it's wonderful." He said, "Don't you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta?" I said, "It's going to happen here. Somebody's going to do it here." He said, "Don't you think we ought to make it happen here?" And I said, "What do you mean we?" He said, "You take this side of the cafe and I'll take the other and we'll make it happen here." And we did. We went around, we talked to other students. Our group got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And finally, a couple of weeks later, we had Atlanta's first sit-ins, because the newspaper story should have been called "How to Sit In." It told how these Greensboro students were dressed, what they did, how they comported themselves, where they sat, how they behaved, and how they went home at the end of the day saying they'd be back. It was like a blueprint. So we just followed the blueprint. We did it too.
I had noted here to ask you, is it true that you were arrested at a sit-in?
Yeah, I was arrested the first time at Atlanta City Hall. It has a cafeteria in the basement. And we went through the line, you know, like past steam tables. And these black women serving the food, and you can see them looking at us, and you knew they had never seen anybody who looked like them looking back at them from that side of the steam table. So we come to the cashier, as a white woman, and she's very polite. She says, "Oh, I'm awfully sorry. We can't serve you here. This is just for City Hall employees." I said, "You got a big sign outside. It says City Hall cafeteria. The public is welcome." She said, "We don't mean it." I said, "We'll stay here till you do." And she called the police, and the police came and took us away.
I want to go on with your life here. This is marvelous stuff. You were elected at the age of 25 to the Georgia House in 1965, and then I gather you were not seated due to you were a Vietnam protester, and they didn't want to seat you in the House of Delegates or Representatives,
House of
whatever they call
Representatives
it.
in Georgia. Yeah, they accused me of being guilty of treason and sedition. And all I'd said is that the war was not a good idea. In fact, I thought it was a bad idea. But at any rate, they threw me out. We filed a lawsuit. It was heard by the Supreme Court, and the court ruled in my favor, unanimously in my favor. So almost a year to the day after I was put out, I finally got back in. And I stayed for the next 22 years, 21 years.
Well, you said you were in the Senate, you were in the
In the
House,
State
and,
Senate,
and,
yeah.
and then you were in the State Senate. You also, incidentally, I was about to go past, at one point in your life, when I think in 1968, your name was put in nomination for Vice President of the United States.
Well, this is the '68 convention, and if you remember, it was a tumultuous occasion.
Yes.
And really big fights, not only in the streets, but inside the convention hall between the anti and the pro-war forces, roughly divided between the Hubert Humphrey forces and the Eugene McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy forces on the other side, but that's not clearly what happened. But at any rate, the McCarthy forces wanted to have the floor, and the only way they could get the floor was through the device of nominating someone for vice president. And I was asked if I could do it. I said, listen, I'm too young for this. They said, we don't care, we just want to get the floor, and so my name was put in nomination. The idea was that every nominee got a nominating and 2 seconding speeches, and these speeches would be used to argue the point against the war, but as it turned out, they wouldn't allow my seconders to speak, and so after one round of balloting, I withdrew. I'll tell you what's interesting is since then, I've run into a lot of people who are at that convention, and each one of them tells me that they voted for me. Now, if that was true, it should have been me as the vice president instead of this guy Muskie, you know, but of course it was Ed Muskie instead.
It was. Mr. Bond, 30 years ago, when you were a young college student, leading sit-ins in Atlanta, the Reverend Martin Luther King was assassinated. Do you have special memories, inspirations from that day? What?
Well, you're doing
That
me a
day.
favor. I was older than a college student. I was 28 years old.
Oh, good.
I remember the TV was on, and either Chet Huntley or David Brinkley came on and said, Dr. Martin Luther King has been shot in Memphis, but shot, not killed. And, you know, I remember being shocked by this, but not devastated by it. And seconds later, he came back and said, Dr. Martin Luther King is dead. And although he and I were by no means intimate, close friends, I felt as if a family member had been taken away. If someone I was intimately associated with had been taken away, I just had this feeling of just irreplaceable loss.
I'm sure of that. Now, take some time, 30 years later, and let's you mostly talk about the status of the civil rights movement that Dr. King led. What are the positive things about it 30 years later?
First, I think we make a mistake when we compare today to the King period. If you draw a line of civil rights activity from the founding of the nation until now, the 60s are a big blip. But the normal period is sort of like this, little ups and downs, little ups and downs. That's normalcy. So comparing today to the 60s really makes today suffer. Having said that, the positives are that there seems to be a sizable opinion in the United States that, number one, we have a racial problem. Number two, we've got to do something about it. We disagree about what to do, but I think all of us generally agree that it's a problem and it's got to be dealt with. There are other positives in that there's a large structure of law, and I don't mean just affirmative action, but anti-discrimination law that covers not only racial minorities, but women and other disadvantaged Americans, other ethnic racial minorities. That structure is in place. It's not going to go away. It is here forever. It's going to remain, and that's a great, great positive.
Very interesting. Well, what now are the disappointments? What are the negatives?
The disappointments are that 30 years after King's death that we haven't come as far as I thought we would have. I didn't think we'd be in the promised land, but I thought we'd be further along. There's other disappointments, and again, this is that unfair comparison I'm talking about with the King era and today. In the King era, hundreds of thousands of Americans were engaged in solutions to this problem. Today, It is primarily a leadership fight. The leaders of civil rights organizations working with members of Congress, working against some members of Congress, working with the President of the United States, and the hundreds of thousands of involved people that were on the scene in 1960, 65, 68. They're not here. I don't know where they are, but they're not here.
Well, when you do see some of those people who were the involved people, they seem to have a feeling that sets them apart from the ones that are doing this like a piece of politics and which side's going to dominate the next thing. It seems to me, does that, when you do see someone like yourself who really came up out of sit-ins and such, can't you tell them apart from the rest of us?
Sometimes you can, but you know, I think the condition of racial minorities like a man whose house is burning down, and here comes a fellow with a bucket. Now, are you going to say, where'd you get that bucket? Or why are you coming up here? Aren't you going to say, is that gasoline or is that water? And if it's water, come on. I'm glad to see you. I don't care why you're here or what your motive is. So I think we're in the position of saying, come on, we want you. Pour the water on.
That's very good. Where did I think of the decision, and as I look back, I have some fogginess about it, but I think of the incredible Brown versus Board of Education decision in '54, and then I think of how I sort of expected that things would sort of be quite orderly, like a nice Supreme Court decision that went several more places. You referred in a speech at the University of Virginia about the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson impacts after the 1954 decision. Eisenhower from '52 on, and then can you do that?
Sure. Well, remember this. Here's '54. The Brown decision says separate but equal has to end, and that decision does more than legally end segregation. It gives moral license to the movement to challenge segregation's morality too. But in this period, first you've got Dwight Eisenhower, and Eisenhower is a benign racist. He encourages the Chief Justice of the United States to rule against the black plaintiffs in the Brown case. And this vacillation, his refusal to ever endorse the Brown decision while he's president, never encourages the resistant white South. Now he's followed by John F. Kennedy, who's a reluctant civil rights warrior. He only reluctantly comes to endorse the movement before his term and his life are cut short. But luckily, he's succeeded by Lyndon Johnson, and Lyndon Johnson is a champion. Here's a guy who doesn't want to be a Southern politician anymore, doesn't want to be a Texan, doesn't want to be a Westerner. He wants to be an American politician. He wants to make his mark, and he's immensely sensitive to civil rights questions, to questions of fairness and justice, and he makes all the difference. I think, had you had this century, and had you had no Lyndon Johnson, we'd be in pretty relatively bad shape today, but because of him, we're in relatively good shape today.
I think that's a remarkable observation.
Well, I tell you something I don't think I would have said then. I'm one of the people who stood outside the White House chanting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today?" You know, the war in Vietnam came between Lyndon Johnson and me.
Indeed.
But he was a great president.
Is your interpretation of Lyndon Baines Johnson's role in civil rights generally accepted by your fellow historians, or are you a little out front with that?
No, I think it's generally accepted by historians, and I think it's accepted by people of my age and time.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen this wonderful book by Michael Beschloff called Taking Power. It's the transcripts of the Johnson White House tapes. This is amazing. And you can see Johnson, as you read his words, twisting arms, bending people over backward, pleading, begging, ordering to get what he wants, and what he wants is to make a mark in civil rights.
Currently, I've scrawled down here that affirmative action is under assault. Public schools are underfunded, and particularly the public schools that black kids tend to go to and poor white kids. Unemployment persists in the poorer 2/5 of the population or something. What about all that?
Well,
where are we going? Is there hopeful things gonna?
I think so. I'm an optimist. There are hopeful signs in all this. Take affirmative action. If you look only at California and Proposition 209, only at Texas and the Hopwood decision, then you got to say affirmative action is in bad shape. But look at the 13 other states where there have been attempts to put this on ballot referendums. They've all failed. Look at the Georgia House of Representatives, which in February of this year voted to retain affirmative action. Look at the Senate of the United States, which in either late February or early March voted overwhelmingly to retain affirmative action in the first federal test in 1998. Look at public opinion polls that show that only 1 out of every 4 Americans wants to do away absolutely with affirmative action. So the news is good, not bad. That's not to say that 209 hadn't been devastating, that Hopwood hadn't been devastating in Texas, but so far that's it, nothing more.
I hope this is my fault, not my profession's. I didn't know there was that much positive side.
You know why it is?
Just informed me.
Because bad news is news. Good news is not news.
We feel a great need to tell this particular bad news.
And
I think the need of getting people fired up.
I'm not saying that affirmative action is secure by any means, but the general trend of things is good, is positive.
Okay. You said recently that I think it's what I heard you say on a television program or somewhere, that a third of blacks are doing pretty well economically, that a third are sort of going along with the lower 2/3 or lower 1/3, but that 1/3 of black people are in, quote, abject poverty.
Yeah.
That's pretty heavy.
It's really heavy, and again, it's one of these half-empty, half-full glasses you look at. That 1/3 in the middle class, that's a result of affirmative action. That's a result of the programs put into effect over the last 30 years. It's a result of the civil rights movement. People who now enjoy middle-class lifestyles who are black, who have an education, who have a job that their mom and dad could not have had. These people owe a debt of thanks to Martin Luther King and the movement that came before him and around him. That 1/3 at the very bottom that are living in hard scrabble poverty, that have seen welfare reform or welfare repeal just take any chance away from them, who are crowding into homeless shelters, who are packing into soup kitchens, those people are in desperate straits, and the chances that their situation is going to improve isn't really very, very bright. So it's a half-full, half-empty scenario. You're, on the one hand, glad that the success of this middle class is as great as it is and proud of what they've done. And you've got to be frightened, however, at the prospects for this class at the bottom.
What are organizations like the NAACP, what are writers and thinkers like yourself, what do you mean to do about this?
Well, we make this argument, and this is the argument I make too, is that the problems facing black Americans are race-based. That's not to say that every problem everybody has is based on race, but that the problems black people as a group have are based on race, and they're based on racial discrimination. Why are black people at the bottom of the economic order? Is it because they don't have good education, don't have good training? Why don't they have those things? I believe, and we at the NAACP believe, it's because of racial discrimination. So we believe that as we diminish racial discrimination, we increase opportunity. We make it possible for boys and girls who don't go to good schools to go to good ones. We make it possible for men and women who don't get job training to get job training. And we make it possible for people who've got everything they have to have, but who are locked out of jobs because of their race, to have those locks fall off the doors and have them walk through and get a decent job. So what we're doing about it is we're fighting racial discrimination. And as that discrimination diminishes, prospects for the people we represent go up.
I look at the increasing expenditures on politics in America, so increasing it boggles my mind as a political reporter. And the effect so far is a steady decline in the voter turnout.
Yeah.
Now that's the environment you live in.
Well, you know, politicians know this. We know if you and I are running against each other for some office, I can attack you viciously, and it's going to drive down the percentage of voters who will vote for both of us. I'm hoping that enough will be left to vote for me. But I know it's going to have the effect of not only driving down your voters, it's going to drive mine down too. So no wonder the numbers are small.
Well, no, that's the best explanation of that I've heard. You again made a note that you seem to agree with your friend, President Mfume of the NAACP, who I believe has said economic rights are civil rights. That's what we have to understand.
Absolutely.
I don't think most of us have. I think we're ready for it, but I don't think we've
we
got
have to
it.
remember that King died in not a civil rights fight. He died in a garbage worker strike. These were the sanitation men in Memphis striking for better pay and better working conditions. A right to a decent job is as basic as the right to vote. If you and I can vote, but we can't work, what difference does it make who gets to be president or who gets to be mayor? So that's absolutely basic. The right to a job, the right to be able to develop a business, to have that business grow and flourish. I mean, those are basic rights. That's the American dream. And we want nothing more than the realization of the American dream.
That's good. Racism today. A young person who is interested in all this and was helping me some with this said that she keeps hearing that racism is more underground today than it was 20, 30 years ago, that it's therefore more dangerous. Do you sense that?
Oh, yes, I think she's absolutely right. You know, when I was coming up, there were these signs, white and colored, and you knew that was it. That was it right there. And you could march against that. You could file a lawsuit against that. You could do a number of things to make that go away. Now these signs are gone. But the attitudes behind the signs aren't gone. They're still in people's minds, but you can't look in people's minds. You go apply for a job, or I do, and they say, gee, the job was just filled 5 minutes ago. Is that true? Or are they just saying that because they don't want to hire me? I don't know. How am I going to find out? When I do find out, what am I going to do about it? So it's just a more difficult scene today than in the past. It's a little harder to pinpoint exactly who the bad guys and the good guys are, but we know there are bad guys and good guys out there, and as soon as we determine who's who, then we can do something about it.
Help me with Louis Farrakhan. The Million Man March had tremendous impact in the country, much more than I thought it would have. I was unprepared. And while praising the marchers, you've been quoted as saying, and I have heard you now say, that Farrakhan was, quote, an anti-Semite, a homophobe, and really an anti-Democrat, little d, unquote. Is he a help or a hindrance or what?
Well, you know, again, it's one of these half full, half empty things. You know, the older I get, the more I know you can't answer questions yes or no. There are things Farrakhan says that everybody listening to this show would say, hey, I'm for that. I agree with that. That's wonderful. Raise your family up. Educate your kids. Don't drink. Don't smoke. Live a clean life. Worship God. We all believe in that. But the other part of his message is so horrific. Anti-Semitic, homophobic, anti-Catholic, you know, just awful, that it drowns out the good part of his message. So what do you do with him? You cannot associate, I don't think, with a man who carries such a message of hate. And that kept me away from the march. But as I said, in the aftermath of the march, I talked to a lot of men who told me that they had gone not for Louis Farrakhan, but for themselves. They wanted to show America. There was a new picture of themselves. They are not gangbangers, they are fathers, they're businessmen, they're churchgoers, they're family men. They described it, many of them, as a mystical experience. And so I think the thing itself was wonderful, but I just couldn't go there to be with him.
There's an unsettling controversy about the persistent report growing in its support, supported apparently by Mrs. King, that James Earl Ray, the convicted assassin, was not alone in the crime. Indeed, that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI were part of a conspiracy within the government or something, etc. Jesse Jackson himself said recently, there is, quote, a haunting question whether the government was involved in that murder. You have spoken to that before, but speak to that.
Well, there is no doubt in my mind, and I don't think there should be a doubt in anybody else's mind, that James Earl Ray pulled the trigger that fired the gun that killed Martin Luther King. He bought the gun. His fingerprints are on the gun. His fingerprints on the windowsill from which the gun was fired. He rented the room down the hall from the bathroom where the windowsill is, where the gun was fired. He was seen running away. He dropped the gun as he went away. He drove to Atlanta in a car in which a map was found, in which Dr. King's home and office were outlined in red. Every single piece of evidence, and none contrary, points to James Earl Ray. And most importantly, James Earl Ray confessed to this crime. Now, were there others involved with him? I have no idea. I suspect that they were, quite probably his brothers. He had two brothers who were his partners in crime. And there's reason to suspect that they might well have been involved in it. If they were, who can tell us about this? James Earl Ray can tell us about this. We don't need to have a trial. His brother Jerry can tell us about this. You know, I'm not saying it's beyond the realm of utmost fantastic possibility that J. Edgar Hoover had some hand in this, but I've seen no evidence that that's the case. And the capable lawyer representing Mr. Ray, Bill Pepper, whom I've known for 35 years, is doing what every good lawyer does when he defends a client, especially if your client is guilty, blame somebody else.
We have heard one of the remarkable people of this time in America here, talking for a half hour. What we haven't brought up is that he is a professor at both American University and the University of Virginia, a marvelous lecturer. He has written books. He has written all kinds of articles. He has written poetry. He's been a TV commentator, and he's the best guest I've ever had on a television show.
Oh, that's kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
For more information about the guests and topics on For the Record, visit our station website at avenue.org/WHTJ.